I felt like in a startup, meritocracy thrives, and it sort of doesn't matter what you're doing or even what you're good at. It sort of matters how quickly you could learn and be good at something that the company needs to do. I had, kind of been doing my own product marketing before we had product marketing, but I also understood selling. Like I had a pretty well-informed perspective on what's successful. I benefited a lot of my career from staying with a company that struggled when other people were leaving.
You're listening to the EnterpriseReady podcast, a show aiming to change the enterprise software narrative from how to sell to enterprises to how to build for enterprises. We'll interview industry experts and enterprise software founders as we break through the jargon, establish a common vernacular, and share the lessons learned from building the world's best enterprise software. Hi, I'm Grant Miller, creator of EnterpriseReady and founder and CEO of Replicated, where we enable cloud-native software vendors like HashiCorp, CircleCI, Sneak, and many others to operationalize and scale the distribution of their modern on-prem applications. Check us out at replicated.com. The EnterpriseReady podcast is brought to you by Heavybit, a program dedicated to helping startups take their developer products to market. For more information, visit heavybit.com. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, or just learn more about enterprise features, find us at enterpriseready.io. In this episode of the EnterpriseReady podcast, I sit down with Jay Simons, former president of Atlassian and current partner at Bond Capital. Jay is well known for his contributions and leadership at Atlassian, where he helped the company transition from startup to the massively publicly traded behemoth it is today. And this episode is a doozy. Jay and I start by going deep on his early career, learning about his experiences growing the go-to-market at Plumtree Software during the original .com boom and subsequent bust. There are tons of important lessons here, but I think that Jay's time at Plumtree exemplifies how early employees can really launch their careers at an enterprise software startup by stepping up to solve some new challenges on a regular basis. We then transitioned to Jay's time at Atlassian. We learned so much about the early product, adherence to first principles thinking, and how they broke many of the unwritten rules along the way. We focused on how they made the transition to become enterprise ready, both in terms of features, but also in terms of processes and priorities. Finally, we conclude with a little about what Jay is up to now at Bond Capital, where he's investing in growth stage enterprise software companies. I really hope you enjoy the show. All right, Jay, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me, Grant.
Cool. So to get started, I'd love to just kind of hear the story of your career and sort of your background in enterprise software.
How far back do you want to go?
I mean, I noticed you've kind of been in enterprise software most of your career, right? So let's start at the beginning. It sounds like you started kind of before I would call it the first internet boom. So yeah. It seems like you've been in this ecosystem for a long time.
Yeah, my first real job, I guess, I worked at a law firm through college and then kind of took some gap time after college and did something, wildly different. Then, moved down to San Francisco to get into technology and, had sort of been interviewing around for sales jobs and inside sales jobs. I felt like that was my kind of entry point into technology without kind of a comp sci background or really a functional background in any other discipline. I knew that I was interested in technology. I knew that I could understand it and, translate that into some sales skill. And so I was applying for, mostly entry-level sales jobs. And I actually, the first offer that I got was from Oracle. And I was living in San Francisco with, a bunch of friends from college. And, the job was, I was going to start like in 3.5 weeks. So it was an offer with, start date kind of 3.5 weeks into the future. And I was dreading actually the commute down to Redwood City. And I was excited by Oracle in part because I felt like it was a place where it was sort of a university for technology sales. And, you could kind of ladder up really quickly if you wanted to start your career in technology selling. But I had kind of in the intervening period, I'd gone out to visit a friend in Las Vegas, and I was sort of bemoaning the commute and this idea that it was kind of a big company. And he said, well, a friend of mine started a company in the city, an enterprise software company. If you're interested in enterprise software, you should talk to him. It's just a startup. So I kind of came back to San Francisco and connected with his friend, and that was a guy named Glenn Kelman, who's now the CEO of Redfin. And he was a co-founder of this enterprise software company actually in San Francisco in 97. That was really rare. Everybody was basically down in the valley or outside of the city. And they were, maybe, I don't know, 16 or 17 people. And I went to meet with him, and he was like, yeah, we're just thinking about adding. We've got like one field rep in Chicago and one field rep in New York, and we were thinking about adding an inside sales rep to kind of help, almost like SDR, help qualify demand and kind of work with them to generate leads. And so, sure, let's talk to you about that job. And I kind of interviewed quickly, went around the company, and one funny detail is the Oracle offer. What I remember was like 28 grand. It was like $28,500 or something, which at the time, my last job, I think I was paid hourly as like a paralegal in a law firm. And so it was sort of like a first salary job for me. And I remember thinking, yeah, it was like pretty decent. That's sort of going to pay the bills and, pay off a little debt. And I got this offer from Plumtree. And I remember I was like in the conference room, and the VP of sales at the time had said, "We'd like to make you an offer." There's a sheet of paper on the table, and they pushed it across the table, and I lifted up and looked at it, and it was like a starting salary of $45,000. And I remember probably visibly gulping, but I did the I'm going to have to consider this deeply overnight or something. So can I get back to you in the morning? But like inside my body was screaming, yes. And, I remember I kind of like ran back home to all the roommates, and I was like, this is going to be awesome. Cause, I was really motivated by what the company was doing. And I was motivated by being in the city and not having to rent a car, buy a car, and kind of sit on the train and commute down to Redwood City. So that was my first job, like in inside sales. And the funny thing about that company is, that company basically grew from virtually $0 in revenue when I started up to $80 million 3 years later. And so it was just explosive growth.
Wow.
And I wasn't in inside sales very long. I remember in the office, there was like almost these little, I don't even know what they were. They were like maybe phone booths. Like it was probably like a phone booth. Maybe the office that we occupied used to be a law firm, and it was sort of like this is pre kind of open office plans, but there was this quiet area where you could sort of like sit. It was tiny. I mean, I could touch all four walls just by extending my arms, and that was my office. And I sat in there and just started cranking and calling into companies and pitching Plumtree and trying to understand how to sell. And within the first couple of months, I actually I'd had this opportunity in Canada. And it was with the Ministry of Tourism in British Columbia. And it seemed like a reasonable opportunity. I was sort of talking to the team kind of all over the phone. And I went to the VP of sales, and we didn't have a rep in the West. So I said, well, who should work this? And she said, well, why don't you work it? Just see what you can do with it. And anyway, I managed to close that deal. And it was sort of one of the bigger deals for the company entirely over the phone. And that was sort of within my first handful of months, which was kind of a win. And then the company was growing so quickly that they were like, we need you out in the field. And it was like, it was a field traditional enterprise selling job where, the ASP was 150 grand and, it was a big complex, enterprise software sell. And that was sort of the start of my career in sales and in enterprise software.
And just briefly, talk a little bit about what Plumtree did. I read a bit about it. People were comparing it to Yahoo portal at the time, which I thought was funny, but kind of give me a modern context on what it was.
Yeah, Plumtree began as sort of a knowledge management system for the enterprise. And, it always borrowed consumer concepts. And so the earliest incarnation of the product was this, search and indexing software that organized content from, this is all pre-cloud. And so, it used to be in the enterprise that all your Word documents were like on an NT file share. Like there were these physical, servers where
the F drive.
Yeah, the F drive. It was like the company F drive. And there'd be lots of those. And so Plumtree's, first product was, well, let's index all the places where content exists and organize it kind of into categories on the web, where instead of sort of like mapping to an F drive and like only your computer can browse it and it's kind of woeful to find it through search, we'll give you a web interface that's like, and again, this sort of dates the time, like Yahoo differentiated from Google, unsuccessfully in lots of ways. But one thing that it did is it curated the web into categories. And Google just gave you a search box that, quickly became kind of good enough for you to find anything. You didn't actually need to see sports content in a sports folder. You weren't kind of browsing, you were just searching. And Yahoo really was sort of like a browse first and kind of search second in a category. And so you could narrow your search by saying, I'm really interested in content about basketball. And so I would drill into sports and then into basketball. And then I would search and I'd sort of like, get a bunch of curated content or index content on the web. And Plumtree's, first product was, let's do that for kind of all of the content that's scattered around F drives, and NT file shares inside of the enterprise. And so it was a knowledge management system. There's a big category, enterprise software category around knowledge management. And it quickly evolved from that to kind of augment the web experience in the same way that Yahoo did with consumer portals. And so, back in the 90s, it was the thing to do where you would kind of create a front page to the internet on Yahoo, and you'd be able to have your stock quotes and your sports scores for your favorite teams and weather in your city and news from, the news sources online that had them that you wanted to kind of pull together. And it gave you kind of a simple digest of all the things that you cared about. And Plumtree's idea was, well, companies should, offer the same thing to their employees, where on your intranet, which again was sort of like an early technology approach where companies kind of had webs inside of their firewalls.
Sure.
And began to have more web technologies that were accessible to their employees, that you would want kind of a curated front page to all that stuff. And so you'd want, a view of requisitions that you need to approve in kind of your HR system. You'd need, POs that you'd need to click yes on from, SAP. You would need maybe a snapshot of your email, inbox. You'd have kind of a list of, workflow items from the document management system like Documentum. And if we could composite all that together into, a personalized web experience, that portal, that front page would, save people time and kind of increase productivity. And that's part of the reason why that sort of like, Plumtree had created the corporate portal market, the portal market for enterprises. And, it was a concept that had a lot of merit. It's sort of like, that's why the company grew from 0 to 80. The concept was heavily copied in sort of the late 90s and 2000s. And actually, the product that probably most people remember from that era is a product called Microsoft Sharepoint, which effectively was that. It was like, how do we aggregate kind of access to content into kind of a personalized web experience for, people and teams. Yeah. And, Plumtree had a great ride until, every enterprise software company at the time, Microsoft, SAP, BEA, Oracle, PeopleSoft, you name it, like every big enterprise incumbent said, well, I'm going to have a portal on top of my thing. I'm going to have, my PeopleSoft. And it's not too hard to add, they were called portlets at the time, but it's not too hard to kind of integrate some part of the web experience of, a sister product or some other thing in the enterprise. So, your My SAP or your My PeopleSoft becomes more valuable as a starting point for your day when you come to work.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. So your role there evolved. So you went from inside sales to be kind of field sales, and then it sounds like you went a little bit more international.
Yeah. So, part of what attracted me to Plumtree and, away from Oracle is I felt like in a startup, meritocracy thrives. And it sort of kind of doesn't matter what you're doing or even what you're good at. It sort of matters how quickly you could learn and be good at something that the company needs to do. I was excited by that prospect where, there'd be more things for me to figure out, to learn and figure out if I'm good at and figure out if I could do, and more opportunity to test myself. And so maybe, the first example of that was when they said, well, hey, you've never kind of sold in the field, but we need somebody to do it, go out and do it. And I became kind of the Western account manager for the West. But at the time I thought, because I grew up in Washington, and I thought, if I teleport into the future, it might be nice to be, back home next to friends and family and, maybe live in Portland or Seattle again. And that was sort of my long-term dream at the time was, eventually maybe move back home from California. But what had happened was I was the only sales rep at headquarters. And so I kind of managed the sales at plumtree.com email address inbound to the company. And, somebody was from Chicago, I was like, hey, Jim, here's Chicago. If somebody was in New York, I was like, hey, Shelly, here's New York. But kind of everything else we didn't have a rep for, I just managed. And so we started to get all this inbound from Europe and from, like way more in Europe because like Europe, began to kind of awaken to the concept and, was sort of a fast follower behind what enterprises were doing, in North America. And so all of a sudden I had pipeline with, really big companies, Shell and British Petroleum and Nokia and, all of these sort of like, big European juggernauts. And I went to the VP of sales at the time and I just said, hey, listen, all of a sudden, like there were real opportunities where the CIO of British Petroleum or British Telecom or Nokia wanted to meet with us because they were very serious about deploying our technology kind of broadly. And so there was only so much you could do over the phone from San Francisco. So I went to the VP of sales. I'm like, look, I've got kind of all of this pipeline, that's been built. And by the way, I've been closing deals, in the Pacific Northwest and in the West Coast. But what are we going to do about this stuff? And he was like, well, let's go over and do this CIO meeting with the British Petroleum together, see what else you can build up. So I built up, for him and I, this kind of like, incredible week of meeting with big companies all over Europe. And within the week after that, like we closed British Petroleum, or one of them that, was one of the bigger deals in the company. And, he's like, man, we need a European operation right now. And so he gave me a choice. He's like, I know you've been thinking about, the Pacific Northwest was exploding for us because it was pre-Microsoft. And so like in pipeline in the Pacific Northwest, it was Boeing and Weyerhaeuser and PACCAR and you name it. Like it was every company in the Pacific Northwest. And he said, this is like 99 now. And he said, do you want to go over to London and kind of like start Europe, and we'll hire a team around you. You can sort of like be the flag that we plant over there and kind of get things going. Or do you want to? We're going to have to carve up the West, and we're going to have to add people in California and Oregon. The company's growing, so you're probably going to have one of those opportunities. And I was like, man, I would love to go to Europe, but and this is sort of a funny story. I was like, but I know somebody. There's a friend of mine that I think you should interview for the Pacific Northwest, account manager, the guy that'll run that territory. And so we were going back to Europe again, like 3 weeks later, to sort of like deal with this pipeline. He's like, let me meet your friend. And we were flying to London out of San Francisco. And, this good friend of mine from college that, is probably one of the most accomplished salespeople I'll ever meet. But he was selling, I think at the time he was working for like SC Johnson Wax as like a sales rep, selling like shaving cream into grocery store, like no technology experience, I think. But we flew him down, and Jim and I were flying, the VP of sales were flying to London. And Matt had flown down from Seattle, and I introduced the two of them. And, we had like 2.5 hours before our flight or something. And so Jim said, hey, Matt and I are going to talk, like go grab a cup of coffee. And I went and grabbed a cup of coffee and kind of waited and sort of like watched them talk. And then they kind of flagged me over, and I kind of walked up, and, Jim, the VP of sales, says, so, hey, Jay, why don't you say hello to the next area sales manager for the Pacific Northwest for Plumtree? And so he had given kind of Matt the job on the spot. And the funny addendum to that is that next year, I'd moved to London. And that next year, the company we went from 3 to 30 million. And Matt closed 9 of the 30.
Wow.
And so he, I knew it was going to be a good territory. I didn't know it was going to be that good of a territory, but I think testament to his skill. And then, I'd ended up in Europe and had a great time and sort of like built Europe up. We hired an MD, and, I was both selling and then, part of, I guess, a culture carrier into the company that we were building, extension of the company that we're building there. And then I had kind of another choice where they were like, this has gone really well. Europe's sort of grown up and exploded. That was part of like our 30 to 80. It was that European expansion. And I'll tell you one funny addendum about that. That was a mistake I made. But then they said, well, do you want to stay in Europe or, selling, and kind of, do you want to run the Nordics, or do you want to run, like Eastern Europe, or what do you want to do? Or we're doing the same thing in Asia. Do you want to go there? And I said, I'll go to Asia. And so, we started the Asia operation in Australia. And then I ended up running Asia and spent 1.5 years in Australia, and then moved up to Singapore and spent a couple of years in Singapore, basically running the region. And, the one funny addendum, and then I'll pause, is I'd seen what had happened in the Pacific Northwest, with pipeline that I'd started. And so when I kind of negotiated the Europe thing, I said, well, what about all this? Like, I've got all this pipeline. I've been working for a while, and we're hiring reps that you want me to hand pipeline to. But, I want some kind of recognition for laying the groundwork here. How do I participate in sort of the success of what Europe's become that I've contributed to with pipeline? And we kind of worked out a deal where they would pay me in stock. And the mistake there is like, at Plumtree, at the time had sort of like a pretty high valuation, and then had gone through the dot-com crash kind of followed that. And so I'd have all this equity that was granted at like, $12 a share. And when Plumtree went public, it eventually went public at like $4.50 a share. So I was sort of underwater on all the stuff that I had. I thought that it was clever to negotiate for equity at the time, and I learned a cash is king lesson, at least in that case.
Yeah, that's funny. I mean, the crazy part is like that's such high growth at that rate at that time. Like what slowed Plumtree down? Like, 'cause I think the ultimate acquisition by BEA was for like 200 and something million.
Yeah, it was mostly Microsoft.
Okay.
And secondarily, just all the noise in the enterprise space that I'd mentioned around, BEA, Oracle, SAP, every big enterprise software company came out with something that looked and smelled like what we had. And it just was a headwind in terms of convincing customers that we were unique and different. And then Microsoft, it's interesting to look at what Microsoft does today when they decide to compete, because at least back in the time, it wasn't instantaneous, right? Like even though they were a global company, they really kind of put a dent in Plumtree's business in North America. And by the way, I was in Europe at the time, and it took them a long time to kind of enable. Like I was leaving Europe by the time that Europe, began to have a little headwind, and I was going to Asia. And then when I got to Asia, the North American reps were kind of frantic, and the North American business was slowing down, or it slowed down significantly. The European business was just starting to slow down. APAC was taken off. It just felt like I was always sort of a little in front of Microsoft, kind of switching on their global sales channel and kind of enabling both their indirect channel and their direct sales organization to really talk about SharePoint as a new product. It took them a couple of years. But, and then the other thing was the dot-com crash happened. Plumtree was primed to go public at the end of 2000. We had the S1 on file, and, I think was a very hotly followed company. And then the dot-com crash happened. We sat 2001 out and then went public in 2002 with just a very different kind of growth profile than we had in 2000. I stayed with that company. It was basically with that company for 12 years through the acquisitions. I went public in 2002 and got acquired by BEA in 2005. And then BEA, got acquired by Oracle in 2008. And I was effectively with Plumtree's product line that entire time. And that was also a really good learning experience because, I went through the journey of, Plumtree had a really generous lunch program, that I think at the time in the city was probably maybe one of the only companies that did that. Now that's sort of table stakes for a software company. You've got, meals provided and all that sort of stuff. But it was, one of the most popular portlets in our portal was the lunch portlet, where we had kind of figured out a way to kind of web enable all the PDF menus at the time from restaurants around the city. Some developer had sort of like, ingested them and sort of like, figured out a way to represent them on the web in a way that we could kind of order lunch through, a bunch of different places. We would like pick a restaurant kind of per day, but the whole company would basically order lunch online through this kind of portlet. And then it'd get delivered and we'd all eat lunch together and the company would pay for it. And that was, at the time, felt like just this incredible benefit. And also like, fostered all these social connections. I remember like some of, just sitting around the table and talking to engineers and just learning about all sorts of different things from those. But, when the company hit harder times, we needed to pull back from some of those benefits. And I went through kind of the arc of, we're actually going to have to say goodbye to people. I went through a layoff, which was, super painful and hard. And then we, began to kind of ratchet back. Well, actually, like we're not going to subsidize lunch anymore. We're going to subsidize just half of lunch. And then it was like, we'll still bring lunch and kind of organize that, but you pay for it yourselves. But we've got kind of vending machines with snacks that, you don't have to put money into, you just push a button. And then it was like the vending machines cost $0.25. And then the vending machines, and it was this progression of, the company mostly just trying to make it work, but it was really hard culturally. And, the other thing that I learned, through that is, there was a sense of, even though it was a great culture, there was a sort of like a little current of kind of entitlement. At the end, people were really rubbed the wrong way because, hang on a minute, where'd my free lunch go? And I remember the CEO at the time, just said, if you're in it for free lunch, like you're like you shouldn't be here because like you need to be here to fight for the survival of this place. And that's going to be a lot of hard work. And it means that there is no more free lunch. We can't afford it because we're trying to keep people employed. And that's what this is about. And I remember being, really influenced by that and then being, committed to the mission even through hard times because it was hard. And that kind of perseverance and, like stick it with itness, the people that kind of like were in the foxhole saying like, we're going to do everything we can, to fight for the survival of this place, had a huge impact on me.
Yeah. I mean, do you think that there's, sort of hindsight being 2020, like, are there things that Plumtree could have been doing differently from a product perspective, from a go-to-market perspective? Like, is there anything you look back and you're like, oh, I wish we had, done X, Y, or Z, or maybe had we done it, it would have increased our chance for success? Any of those sort of like insights?
Well, I think now, the lessons that I've taken away over the past handful of years, like pricing and packaging matters, in kind of the market. And it could have been that, Microsoft always had the ability to either be more aggressive or more bold. But, it was hard for us to turn on a dime with the way that we were structured. That would have been the thing that I would have done is I would have said, it was a very expensive product because, this was the generation of really complex enterprise software, perpetually licensed, all kind of on-prem client server. Like, Plumtree started as a client server. I mean, I went through the evolution of client server to web. Plumtree's first product, that kind of indexing thing, was a client server technology. We actually installed kind of the directory client on your Windows machine.
Yeah, as like a Java app.
No, I think it was like probably a C++ like native.
Oh yeah, like Word was. Yeah,
like Word was. I mean, exactly. It was sort of like it was a Windows client app that connected with an NT server that did all the indexing. That was the first product, and then it evolved.
And that server was like installed in the customer's environment, right?
Yep.
Like they would install it in their server closet, et cetera. Yeah.
Then web technologies came around and it went to the web, but it was still kind of a the client server web architecture where the client became the web browser, but everything was installed kind of on-prem to do sort of all the heavy lift for things that you wanted to browse, and the web pages that got generated were by a server that was installed on the customer's infrastructure.
And perpetually licensed, you said, as well, the whole time too.
Perpetually licensed with maintenance support, at 18% of the perpetual license. So the perpetual license fee was the thing that you were working hard to win, and that was in the hundreds to millions of dollars. So that's a hard ship to turn on a dime, where you've got a big competitor that is sort of priced comparably, but has like Microsoft, bigger distribution and sort of a bunch of inherent advantages that are tough to overcome. I'd like to think that, knowing what I've learned kind of over the past decade or more with Atlassian, and sort of like seeing how companies have evolved and how enterprise software has evolved, it's like easy to say, man, if we only could have done those things back then, it would have been different. But the structure would have made those changes really hard. The thing that we did do, and this was actually, it's a funny story about my introduction to Atlassian, because, we had recognized that just staying the course, wasn't kind of a winning strategy. And it would have been really difficult to sort of like retool the distribution model around that product. We actually and compete in the face of all of these big juggernauts that, claim to have the same thing that we did. It was just like every customer opportunity was just sort of a into the Thunderdome death match, right? And so the thing that we did do is we said, well, we've got to reinvent our product strategy. Like, we've got to pivot here and try to salvage what we can from like really good customer and market and product oriented DNA. And we've got a good sales organization. If there's something else that we can fit into the market to sell, that'll work. And so we had kind of pulled the best product thinkers, from around the company. And, Plumtree had more than one product at that time. It had kind of a content collaboration system that was sort of a little bit like Documentum, or a little bit like Broadvision, or companies at the time, where you could create web content. You could upload a document and you could check it out, and it had workflow around it on the web and stuff like that. And it had a reporting data, a bunch of different things. And so we had pulled kind of the best product people from all of those various products and said, hey, we're going to form a new team, and your mission is to basically come up with a new product strategy. And so no pressure, but kind of you got to save the company. And at that time, I had moved back from APAC into marketing. and so was running marketing and sort of aspects of product strategy. And so I was connected to that team. And I went to check on that team in, I don't know, 3 weeks in, a couple weeks in, just to see what ideas they were floating around. And I walked in, and we had given them kind of a part of the office where they had their own space. And I remember it was like they'd called themselves IDEO.
Yeah.
And they had kind of comfy couches, sort of like they'd kind of decked out their little space. And by the way, all those folks have just gone on to incredible careers, but all like just super smart and connected, engineers and product managers. And I went to check on them, and I said, "Hey guys, what have you guys come up with?" And they were like, "Well, nothing really yet that we're excited about, but look at this product that we're using to riff on ideas together." And they gave me a demo of a product called Confluence from, this little Australian company called Atlassian. And, I'm like, man, that's the irony here is thick, right? Like, we are a collaboration software company, effectively tasking you with coming up with new collaboration software that we can sell, and you're using someone else's collaboration software. And that was my first introduction to Atlassian. Like, I think in its second year, I went back to my office, and I was like, God, what is this little Australian company that I've never heard of, that these guys are excited about the products that they're building? And I remember I looked, and I was like, man, their products are so cheap. And I had this idea where I was like, man, if we acquired this company, we could add a couple of zeros to their product prices, give them to our, very talented, kind of well-equipped enterprise sales organization.
Sure.
And maybe we could take some of our products. They talked about kind of distributing over the web at the time. Maybe we could take some of our products and have a version of our products that we could sell through that online channel. Like, maybe there's kind of a marrying of both of these approaches and products that actually would give us the boost we need. So I went and pitched that to the CEO at the time, and he's like, sounds interesting, go figure it out. And this is like 2004. I managed to track down Mike Cannon-Brookes, the founder and co-CEO of Atlassian. I managed to track him down on the phone and had this kind of whirlwind conversation with him where I was asking him a bunch of questions like, what's your revenue? And like, how many customers do you have? And what do you think revenue will be next year? And, like, what's the product strategy? And we sort of like had this, meandering conversation for about 40 minutes. And then at the end, he kind of cut me off, and he's like, mate, sounds like you're trying to figure out if you can buy us, and we're not for sale. And I said, well, really, at any price? And he's like, probably not at any price, but it would at least have to be 30 million. I remember this vividly. And at the time, they had just done $1 million in revenue. It was like, his version of there is no price, because 30 times, was just crazy at the time.
Yeah.
Not crazy now.
Yeah.
So it was sort of like just book closed. But that was sort of like, it's funny how life works. That was sort of like my serendipitous connection to this company.
I love that in so many ways.
Then went back to kind of, figuring out Plum Tree. And by the way, that team, that IDEO team, came up with things that we ended up building, and then we got acquired by BEA, and sort of the products like didn't really fit into BEA strategy, but they were incredible things like that. I think like now you see more of, like they were basically sort of a version of sort of the social web for the enterprise, like pre-Yammer, pre-Jive. Like, we built that. We had built kind of an enterprise version of like a social bookmarking service like Delicious that I still think would be a useful product in the enterprise. We'd sort of built that. It was a different way for people to signal that content is valuable and to build kind of an expert network on top of that signaling. We built a product that, predated low code, no code, but it was basically like an application builder for internal apps inside of a business, where you could do a whole bunch of stuff with kind of drag and drop elements on a page. It was sort of inspired by how the enterprise at the time was littered with, Access databases and Lotus Notes apps and FileMaker Pro, app. Like there wasn't anything kind of in the modern client server kind of web architecture for the enterprise that was giving people the ability to kind of pull data into a web experience. And so we built that. Kudos to, that IDEO team, because they came up with things that now I think there's, big businesses have been built around.
Yeah. I was actually thinking sort of a similar thought as you talked about the challenges of growing Plumtree. Kind of asked the question just to see what you thought, like, could you have done anything? But I think there's this it's funny because Plumtree's origins, sort of being compared to consumer and taking so much from consumer, but there's a very common sort of concept and narrative around consumer startups during the .com boom / bust that like those many of those ideas became companies later, right? Like the classic is like Webvan became, Instacart and like Amazon Fresh and all these things. But from what you're saying, it actually feels like the same things probably happened in enterprise, right? Where these companies, it was just kind of more of a timing challenge. And that timing can sometimes be around market size and opportunity and technologies that are available to make it happen. But, it's probably worth revisiting a lot of those sort of like older concepts because, oftentimes what we've seen in the web, the consumer web is like that time has come for many of them.
Totally. Yeah, timing is everything. So, there's sort of great solutions to problems that are just a little bit early.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so before we dive too much deeper in Atlassian, which I really want to spend a bunch of time on, just like talk about your transition from sales and sort of like running these international orgs into product marketing and marketing, because I think that's an interesting part of your career.
In the context of Plumtree, it was a relatively easy transition because I had, spent, at that time, I guess it would have been like 6 or 7 years selling and then running a region. So running a sales team. So I'd sort of like grown up into sales management, but had, deep experience and appreciation for the customer, the market, the problem we were solving, deep connection to the product. Like I understood the product like the back of my hand, having sold it for so long. And I was in Singapore. We'd opened Japan and Korea and China, and APAC was going really well. But I was worried about getting stuck in Asia Pacific as head of sales for Asia Pacific or head of APAC. And I'd gotten married at the time, and my wife and I were thinking about starting a family, and in my late 20s, I guess at the time, and wanted to get back to the US. And it was hard because the US was, as I'd mentioned, the US growth had slowed, because of Microsoft, and it was in, sort of like the thick of all of the competition in the landscape. And so there wasn't really an opportunity to kind of go back into a sales role or a sales leadership role. And so I was just kind of, trying to find out if there's something that I could do that was interesting because I wanted to stay with a company and if there were things that I could do. And actually, like the first thing that I came back to was, and this was also sort of like they kind of created a role for me in like, business development where there was an idea around, well, could we OEM our technology into all of the enterprise companies that don't yet have a portal but may want one? Like, is that sort of a growth strategy? And so could we go to kind of Documentum and, all of the business intelligence vendors like, Business Objects and MicroStrategy and companies that probably, most of the listeners won't remember, but could we go to them and convince them that, hey, actually you need a portal too, because the world of enterprise software is becoming portalized. And rather than build your own, you actually get one that's built that understands, like we can ingest all of, the open kind of portlet concepts. There were like standards around how portlets got built and all that sort of stuff. And we have kind of portlet building engines and a bunch of things that might matter to you. So I came back to try to figure out if that was a business and quickly discovered that it wasn't. It was just too heavy of a lift for all these companies to kind of ingest our technology. And, it was like, it would have taken them a year, I think, to really engineer it in a way that, they'd effectively be white labeling, but engineering our technology into theirs. And the economics on the other end of that weren't meaningful enough. And so I sort of did that for 6 months and realized that, kind of came back to the business and was like, I just don't think this is going to work. Like, I think we've proven that it won't. And then there was an opportunity to take over product marketing. And I was interested in that because, it was an easy transition. When you've been selling, first of all, you work really closely with product marketing because product marketing, is creating the collateral and the positioning and, the competitive kill sheets and all of the stuff that's enabling the sales organization to represent the product in the right way. And I had, kind of been doing my own product marketing before we had product marketing, but I also understood selling. Like I had a pretty well-informed perspective on what's successful. And so it felt like it was an easy transition, because product marketing is in traditional enterprise software, the most closely connected marketing function into the field, right? Like product marketing goes to the sales kickoffs and is the first to pitch the new deck or the first to give the new demo or the first to rip apart a competitor and analyze it and, talk about the ways to differentiate around it. It was a chance to learn something new again. And, they gave me that opportunity. And it was a relatively easy fit because of the things that I mentioned. And then, shortly after that, the person that was running marketing left, and they said, do you want to, it was sort of battlefield promotions, right? They were like, all right, this company is still struggling, and, we need somebody to run marketing. Will you do it? And I was like, yep, I'll do it. I always say that I benefited a lot of my career from staying with a company that struggled when other people were leaving and they're like, this is getting hard and I'm going to go where it's easier. Staying kind of in the hard opened up a bunch of opportunity for me professionally to sort of grow my career and kind of acquire new skills, but also just ladder up. And put me in a position, by the way, to get my when I finally put my head up and wanted to look for something new, and just coincidentally, saw Atlassian was looking for an executive. I was an executive because I'd sort of stuck through, at least in Plumtree, had stuck through kind of the thick and thin to earn it along the way.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm guessing that you also probably, you developed a lot of long-term relationships at Plumtree and BEA, I'm guessing, from folks that you worked with. That I have no idea, but I'm guessing that you've worked with some of them again in later roles. But
yeah, for sure. My group of actual, lifelong best friends, the intersection of all of them, there's some people that I went to college with that ended up working at Plumtree, and, a gaggle of people I just met there. But, there's 10 of us, and the one thread that kind of weaves through us is that experience, in our 20s at Plumtree. And, I think almost all of us were there a long time.
I love that. Cool. So let's talk about the transition to Atlassian, because I think, obviously Atlassian is just such an interesting story, been around for a long time. Sounds like, you had this interesting experience with them, and then 4 years later you joined, right? So they were around for 2 years. You had this experience trying to, poke around to acquire them. And then sounds like they stayed on your radar, and then you saw a role. But tell us about how you kind of joined, and let's get into some of the things you learned at Atlassian.
So yeah, subsequent to that first interaction with Mike, BEA had acquired Plumtree. They offered me a good job, and I was interested. BEA was, I think, the fastest company to get to $1 billion in revenue.
Wow.
At least in enterprise software it was. And so, it was a company that sort of exploded, up in the late 90s and early 2000s. And Plumtree at the time, I think, had 550 employees when it got acquired, and BEA, probably had 5,000. And so I was interested in what does a 5,000 person company look like? I've been part of this startup that grew to 500 people and went public and had lots of ups and downs. But what does a big company look like? And I have a chance to kind of be an executive inside of a big company. And by the way, they'd acquired Plumtree and held it as a business unit, and then acquired another company and put into that business unit. It was a business process management company. So on one dimension, I had kind of the air cover of this big company, and it was sort of I got to go back to school and kind of learn how does a big company do annual planning, and how does it in headcount planning and budgeting and all the things that would be different and bigger, but still have kind of the context of the products that I knew and loved and cared about kind of in the market. So that's why I was sort of thrilled by that opportunity, and I learned a lot. It was a great 2.5 years, and learned some things that I liked about how big companies worked and some things that I didn't like. But all sort of in pursuit of, just learning. And then when Oracle bought BEA in 2008, I'd been there for 12 years, and I felt like, okay, it's time to kind of poke your head up and look around.
You didn't want to accept that $24,000 salary with Oracle when they acquired you?
Again, yeah. And it's funny to come full circle where I was just my professional career kind of started, or could have started, with Oracle. And then I was like, yeah, I don't really want to work for Oracle. I've sort of seen 5,000. I don't need to see whatever they were at the time, 30,000 or 40,000.
Sure.
And so an analyst at Gartner that I knew sent me the job description for, Atlassian was looking for a VP of marketing. And, she was like, I love this company, and I know that you're not going to go to Oracle, and, you should look at this company. I'm like, oh man, here's Atlassian. And, I hadn't really paid close attention to them, but over the intervening 4 years, whenever I'd visit a customer, I used to, take stock of what because we were still selling portal technology. And so like part of the value proposition, we're going to integrate a bunch of things kind of into this,
Sure.
modern web experience. What are the things that in the business that you like, and what are the things that you loathe? And like, give me that list. And Atlassian was always on the list of, we love this product, Jira and Confluence, and like our users love it. And so it always just kind of blipped on my radar around, we've got this Atlassian stuff that everybody's super excited about that's kind of grown in the business. And that was kind of like over the intervening years, they always they kind of like bubbled up in customer conversations. And then I kind of like did a little homework, and they'd, come a long way since I saw them in, 2004, but had all the properties of just a great company. They had a great culture. I think Mike and Scott talked a lot about the culture that they're building, and Plumtree had a great culture, and that mattered to me because I'd come from one, and I knew how important it was. They had great products that customers were fanatical about. I was super intrigued by the early formation of the business model because, having gone from selling where you're really focused on conversion and closing, but really one-to-one, to marketing, where really marketing is about one-to-many. It's about like, what are the things that I do that generate demand broadly? And what are the assets I can create that can influence conversion broadly? Even if in the hands of a salesperson, like I'm working on kind of the one thing that's going to matter to every customer that we're trying to close. And so the latter part of my career kind of switched on this one-to-many synapse, where I became really interested in that sort of like leverage and scale that you can get from activity. And here in Atlassian was a company that was focused on kind of one-to-many selling, in effect, right? Like where you use the internet to distribute and acquire a customer, and you're constantly focused on removing friction to acquire thousands of customers, a month, or thousands of customers a week. You still have to have the same instincts around how am I going to get them to close? Like, what are the problems that I'm solving? What are the obstacles in the way? Those are all sales problems, but in the context of, marketing, where you can solve them at scale and you can solve them, for loads of customers. And so I was just super intrigued by all of those things. And then I was like, I hope for whatever reason that, my little interaction with them in 2004, where, he was like, hey, this is a butt sniffing exercise and we're not interested, for whatever reason, they wouldn't hold it against me. But I met Mike and Scott and kind of met various people on the team. And, I'm fortunate that there were things in me that they wanted and needed. And there were definitely things in Atlassian that I was excited about contributing to. And by the way, it was also a chance to kind of like go back, and I haven't had a chance to do this too often in my career, but the thrilling part of being in a startup and kind of growing is you're forever, I describe it as you're forever breaking new ice in front of you, right? Like you're one of those, sort of like ships that cruise through the Arctic, and it's just you're plowing through, new ice, and you never really get to go back and say, well, like, this is smooth sailing because I've already broken this ice before and I know how to do it. And I derive a lot of energy from that. But then when I went to Atlassian, all of a sudden, like it was, there were things that I'd built before that I knew how to build again. And that was also like another part of thrill, which is like, oh, okay, I've been in this situation before. It's kind of different, but I actually know what to do here. I'm not kind of feeling my way in the dark or guessing. I know what to do. And what Atlassian kind of added to that was just this deep orientation around first principles, where, Mike and Scott valued experience, but didn't overvalue that, compared to just thinking about how you'd solve a problem just faced with it for the first time. And they didn't want kind of the, oh, I know how to do this, I'll just do it the same way I did, to override your curiosity about how you would do it differently, or how you may do it kind of in a situation with some different ingredients. And I learned that really quickly there, because it was a company just angled around kind of, we don't care how things have been done. We care about how we think they should be done. I had kind of had the best of both worlds, because like I had an opportunity to kind of lean on things that I'd done before, and so be a little confident in some situations. But I also had sort of like this canvas in culture of invention, and wanting to like take prior art as just a data point, not as, the recommended path forward.
I love that. Talk about how that was sort of nurtured and like came to life at Atlassian.
It was, I think you see it most prominently in the business model, right? Like you see, Atlassian somewhat famously, was always described as the company without salespeople. And, largely that's true. We can talk about kind of the nuances there. But I think Atlassian was always told, hey, listen, like this model's cute. Maybe it'll get you to 1 million or 10 million, or, there was always sort of a different yardstick. People would say like the model won't work past this point. Just so you know, right? Like we've never seen a company that has done what you're trying to do north of 10 million or north of 50 million or north of 100 million. And every time like we got through what the high watermark that people told us we couldn't break through, it just became a higher watermark. It was all, always just people said, well, you won't, okay, you did it, but you won't get here. And I think it was, we weren't dogmatic about it. I think we were always really thoughtful about what's the right way to grow and what's the smart way to grow, given all of the factors, right? Like market, competition, customer, competitive landscape, expense and cost, growth rate of revenue, like all of those things sort of are a careful chemistry that kind of went into how we thought about the business model. But I think it would have been easy to just say, yeah, you're right. Maybe you're right. Like we need to de-risk. Everybody's telling us we can't. So we need to de-risk this by doing it the way that people say we should. Another example is that I think features prominently in how the company is constructed is like, they shipped their second product in a very different product, by the way, in effectively their second year. And so at the moment when Jira, their first product, is taken off, they sort of like divide their focus and they begin to build a product called Confluence, which is a very different product. Like, I mean, it complements, sort of what development teams, needed to do in that workflow, but it's a very different thing. I mean, you could have said like, hey, and it was like Confluence's, first incarnation was sort of like purely as an enterprise wiki. There were lots of wikis around. And so they could have just said, yeah, we're not going to try to build a better wiki. We're just going to use the ones that exist. And they built a better one. And everybody would have said, don't do that, right? Like, don't divide your focus, like focus on the thing that's winning right now, put all your energy there. But when I think about, what we benefited at a really early age from having to think about priorities and having to think about cross-selling and having to think about like pricing and packaging, with a portfolio. Everything is dimensionally a little bit harder, but we built those muscles really early. And by the way, Confluence was a successful business. I mean, that helped. And so, but it also added kind of some complexity to the business at a really early age that I think was a strength. And it's always tough to play the counterfactual, which is like, well, how much bigger could Jira have been if you hadn't have taken, a third of engineering and began to build a second product? But when I look at how we operated, 10 years later, like a lot of it is just muscle building. We built muscles at a really early age that most companies, when we were 10 years old, most companies were just beginning to think about. They're like, oh man, we have to have a second product because Act 1 is only going to get us so far. Like now we got to come up with Act 2. And by the way, then we have to infuse different DNA into who we are and how we work. And when you do that at 20 people, it's easier than when you do it at 200 people.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, there's so many different angles here. I think to be able to successfully market multiple products, I mean, it is hard, right? Like it's not easy. But I think what you're saying is that if you pull it off, you are set up for more success longer term. It's like you've kind of built the foundations earlier.
Yeah, because you know how to do it. You've figured out how to do it. And then, new people that you hire into the company, it's easier for them to get acclimated into how it works in your context, right? Because you know how it works and you know the things that you're working on to make it better and improve. And I just think there's lots of ways to build great companies.
Yeah.
But, I think we built a great company differently than a lot of great companies are built. And I think that was an early example where I think that second product, and by the way, like Atlassian, I think acquired companies that added to the portfolio in maybe like its fourth year.
Oh, so even before you got there?
Yeah, even before I got there, they acquired.
Oh, interesting.
There was a little company called Senqua, and it was Australia. So it was a little opportunistic. It was, I think people that they knew, and they built, some tools for developers that, were integrated with Jira, kind of on the periphery of Jira. But if I think about it, I think, like what gave them the confidence probably at the time to acquire, and there were like 3 products in there. I think like a product called Fisheye and a product called Crucible and a product called Clover. So they effectively, more than doubled the product portfolio with these things. But I think that what gave them the confidence to do that is they'd already expanded N, right? Like they already had two.
Yeah.
And they'd had a couple of years of understanding, like, how do we manage both of these things? How do we price both of these things? How do we sell both of these things? Like they had confidence to say, like, oh, we've done it with two. I think we can do it with five. Then I think we can do it with six. And, Atlassian's got 15 or 16 products in its portfolio today, and kind of a long history of both organic product development, new things that it adds to the portfolio that it builds, and things that it acquires. But I think all of that's come from, you could say, well, it would have come 10 years later, but I think it would have been different, and I think it would have been harder.
Yeah. So I want to definitely dive into some of these acquisitions and much other things. But just for quick context, we talked a little bit about like, okay, how many products they had at the time, but like, how big was Atlassian when you joined? Who were you reporting to? Was it all based in Australia still? How many customers they have or revenue? Just like any context around when you joined, so that way we can kind of build up from there.
I think, when I joined, it was about 100 people. There were about, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 people in San Francisco and everybody else in Sydney. There was a guy named Jeffrey Walker who was Atlassian's first president. And I think that, he joined maybe in 2006. So I joined in 2008. So he'd been there for a couple of years. And he was a cancer survivor, just super incredible guy. Also, another reason that I was excited to join the company. And so he was effectively running, everything customer facing. He was running, sales and marketing and support and customer service and all that sort of stuff. And I joined to be VP of marketing and reported to him. And he was a cancer survivor. And, I think like maybe, I don't know, like 9 months after I joined, his cancer came back and he got super sick. And I think it was like maybe 5 months after that, he passed away, which was pretty traumatic.
Yeah, that's terrible.
He was beloved by the company, and he just had a huge, bright, energizing personality. And so that was kind of a hard moment, definitely for the company. And his blog handle was Radio Walker, and there's still Radio Walker conference rooms inside of Atlassian with, a little kind of recognition of who he was kind of in the earliest days. And so that was sort of size and shape. And, and then I was sort of had the experience to take over, what he was managing. And so kind of took over sales and support and tried to, step into his shoes as, kind of the an extension of Mike and Scott and, the management team in the US, and, began to grow kind of the business operation in the US, and effectively took over as president shortly after that, and did effectively the same job the entire time that I was at Atlassian.
Yeah, I'm sure he's looking down and really proud of what you and the whole Atlassian team accomplished over those years, though. I mean, it's come a long, long way since then, obviously, from now near a $50 billion market cap, right? So
yeah, I think he would be, and it's like every brick that you lay into a building matters to the building.
Yep.
And, he laid some important bricks. And so,
yeah,
people are still laying bricks that makes Atlassian, taller and stronger. But man, those foundational bricks matter.
Yeah, those cornerstones. Cool. And so, you kind of mentioned that you did quote unquote kind of the same role, after you became president. Like, what was in your purview? Like, what were your responsibilities? What orgs kind of did you manage?
Always, I managed everything customer facing. And so, marketing, sales, support, customer service. I managed lots of odds and ends kind of over the years. So I managed, corporate development and M&A. I managed IT, managed biz ops and strategy, various points responsible for, our strategy and annual planning cadence. The last 4 years, I managed all of our on-prem product development. And so, it's managed lots of different things, when the business, needed me to manage something and kind of either be a custodian of it or grow it. In some cases, it made sense for those things to kind of move into different functions when we had leaders that, that had kind of the latitude and experience and capability to manage them. But the common thread, for me, it was all of go-to-market was, the thing I was most passionate about, and naturally kind of where my experience set is anchored, and kind of always ran that.
Perfect. That's super helpful. And so, when you joined, how like quote unquote enterprise ready was Atlassian and were the products? Obviously there's probably lots of teams inside of companies using it, but would you say the software and like the different products were generally like, enterprise hardened and had all the features that enterprises needed to roll this out company wide?
No. And it's interesting. Another unconventional thing that I think Atlassian did, we were selling into the enterprise, but because, it was software that largely targeted teams, and teams could expand into other teams and then into organizations and then company wide. We were still selling into the biggest companies in the world. We just weren't kind of going wall to wall, and we were okay with that. But like there were things in the product like that I think had some rough edges around scale. Like some of it would be performance, some of it would be simple things like if you were going to add a user to an access control list on a page, there'd be kind of a user picker that didn't have search. So if you had 1,000 people, you'd have to scroll down a list of 1,000 people to pick the user. Like we discovered kind of with time that eventually somebody would say like, "Hey, I've got 1,000 people in my access control list. Add a search box, please." But they're like little kind of rough edges like that in the product, and we were constantly making sure that it would support bigger and bigger populations of users. The thing that we did a little unconventionally is, we would begin to have, some strong signal from bigger customers that wanted to kind of expand usage and that wanted additional capability from us. And we sort of deferred attention around that for a while. I mean, it wasn't acute. Like it was like, hey, listen, you need to improve performance in this, or we want to be able to run this across kind of multiple physical machines, or, we want kind of different admin controls where for the on-prem stuff, we can actually like cycle through an upgrade without bringing the system down, like that sort of stuff. And because it wasn't really acute, it was like, hey, we really need these things, but it's not like we're not moving off you. We kind of deferred. There were other things that we were focused on that we felt were more critical, like building, the cloud platform and the cloud infrastructure for scale. And so we couldn't do both of those things at the same time. So we chose, because it wasn't acute, we're going to actually like park the enterprise focus for a couple of years and, make sure that we're attending to those customers and we're honest with sort of the roadmap, but it's not an urgent priority right now and they should hear that from us. And we sort of deferred until the point that it actually became a little acute. And by that point, we had probably, thousands of customers with more than 1,000 users. And, we were in 80% of the Fortune 500 and, 60% of the G2K. I mean, like if you looked at kind of penetration in the enterprise, we were already there. But a lot of the things that they needed, we hadn't yet built for them. And so we finally focused on it and basically built an enterprise-grade version of the on-prem products that is called now Data Center, the Data Center product line. And that was effectively, an upgrade or an upsell to the existing kind of enterprise base. So if you had more than 500 or 1,000 users, there was a version of the product that, we'd built for that kind of scale and added a whole bunch of like really important capabilities for admins and, and for these big enterprise businesses. And we did that, in 2013 about. And, so we were already over 10 years old and again, had lots of enterprise logos, but we came out with this enterprise grade product that we actually priced, significantly higher than just the standard version that they were using. Mm-hmm. And that's actually where we introduced a direct selling organization because we weren't sure whether or not we could convince customers to, in some cases spend 5 or 10 times as much as they were spending on the standard version by taking that upgrade. And so, we added basically, we call them enterprise advocates. We added, a very small kind of like surgical, strike force to go to these customers and understand whether or not we could convince them to upgrade a data center. And when we realized that we could, the way that we scaled that business was both through our indirect sales channel and then making the product available for customers to buy and upgrade online. And then those 3 dimensions of converting customers like all kick in. And that's sort of what made our enterprise business accelerate as fast as it did.
That's really interesting. And so, okay, a couple pieces in there to pick apart. Do you think that like one of the reasons you were able to sort of push off some of these features and pains for these enterprise teams was because you were realistically pretty low priced at that point, and maybe they were just like, okay, fine, like,
Yeah.
at this price, okay, so that's part of your thesis there.
It was a combination of like the products were important, users loved them.
Yeah.
And so like even if there were some things that they wanted us to do, we were pretty sticky and we were very affordable. And so, if there were things that they wanted us to fix and they were going to consider moving away from us, the thing that they would move to, there'd be an economical deterrent. And so there was probably a little bit of frustration, which like why don't you do these things that we're asking you to do? But they still had incredibly important software and an incredible value.
And it's not user frustration, it's like administrator frustration.
Yeah. Probably some end user frustration too, kind of around performance. But
sure.
I think in hindsight, we chose those priorities really carefully. And I think they were the right ones, right? Because it allowed us to build a really robust cloud platform for all of the customer segments that we serve. And remember, I think, Atlassian, serves everybody from, a 5-user company or a 5-user team up to hundreds of thousands of users. And that's, by the way, really hard to do.
Yeah.
You have to make really careful choices. If you've got the opportunity to support that broad of a customer base, you have to pick and choose what you do because it's difficult to do everything all at once. And so I think that we were really methodical and careful about that choice.
Yeah. So one of the things that I always thought about Atlassian, and I think maybe part of the reason why as a public company it has done so well, and obviously I'm putting out this thesis for you to respond to, but was that that low price, there was just always so much sort of room for you to increase prices with customers, by adding new features or adding new, capabilities, or just raising the price as they used it more at larger tiers. And you compare it to something like Oracle, where it was like they were already maxed out on price, and people felt like they were getting, raked over the coals when they were buying Oracle stuff. Like with Atlassian stuff, it was like, oh yeah, this is all still pretty inexpensive. And so the ability to expand, the ability to charge more, I think is what, to me, that's been a key part of what's fueled your growth.
It is.
Okay.
It is. And it also adds to the equation of, customer love and stickiness. And there's a whole bunch of other things that add to it. But it was a core part. I mean, we focused on this idea of ubiquity, really early, where we just believed that every company should use one or more Atlassian products. That was the trophy we were chasing. We weren't, we weren't excited just to get the 500 biggest companies to use us and spend a lot of money, or the 2,000 biggest. That wasn't what we were after. We were after everybody. And we felt like we could serve all those customer segments the right way over time. And then it just becomes about, sort of like trade-offs and prioritization. Like you could say, hey, listen, if you would have focused on the enterprise business earlier, you would have influenced growth earlier. That's probably true, but it may have distracted us too long away from building the type of cloud platform that we needed to build that actually is like the future of the company.
Sure.
And it would have deferred that by years. And there's a cost to that. Like there's an opportunity cost and there's potentially a competitive cost. There's a whole bunch of things. It's always hard to say again, like if you move the chess pieces around, like what does the game look like? Because it's all hypothetical. But to your point, I think price was always an advantage. And interesting, if you think about it, when we were even like pre-enterprise, like part of the thing that gave us anxiety is sort of there were companies that were dedicated and focused on the enterprise that were growing faster than we were. By the way, so Rally is a good one. Rally went public.
Yeah.
And I can't remember exactly sort of their revenue trajectory, but it was a company that was directly taking on Atlassian with a pure enterprise focus and approach. So top-down selling, kind of out in the field, pretty expensive, go after the G2K, went public. And the move that we did actually, that we sort of let all of the companies that angled just to the G2K that were competing, we just sort of just let them go there, and we lowered price. And we lowered price at the bottom end and the entry point. Like we went from $1,000 10-user license to a $10 10-user license, which was virtually free.
Oh my gosh! Wow.
And none of them copied that move. They all sort of said, well, I guess we'll leave Atlassian to the low end. And what they missed there is that entry point meant that we permeated even the biggest companies with dozens and dozens of 10-user teams. And we just entered bottoms up and became kind of the user choice. And even if a CIO was negotiating with, the sales team of a competitor, if they just pulse their users and if they did a side-by-side comparison of product, because we're also investing more in R&D, like they would hear, oh, geez, this is both cheaper and our users want it more. And so we would win without having to complement it with the similar sales strategy.
Yeah.
And if you look at all the companies that we sort of competed with at the time, I mean, a lot of them aren't around anymore. And they had built kind of like Jive was a competitor and Rally was a competitor. Both those companies went public and had built reasonable businesses in the enterprise segment, and then eventually got gapped, like just ran out of the ability to kind of grow in that market. And you know this too, but I think it's like once you're in the enterprise market, there's lots of examples of this. Salesforce is, it's hard for Salesforce to like really go mid-market. ServiceNow had a mid-market product that they killed. I mean, there's examples of incredible businesses, incredible enterprise software businesses that then when they say, well, actually, we also want to sort of reach into the mid-market and kind of grow business there, it's tough. It's tough because of the way the product's built and oriented. It's tough because of how it's priced. It's tough because of how it's sold. There's just a lot of things that are hard to kind of reconfigure. And in many ways, it's sort of similar to how difficult it was for on-prem companies to kind of make the transition to cloud, because everything's different. And you can't just say, well, now we're also going to have a cloud business. Like history is sort of littered with companies kind of like failing to make that transition successfully or at least swiftly.
Yeah, I'd actually love to jump into that. Obviously, I'm super interested in sort of how Atlassian made that transition. And I think you took a somewhat different approach than a lot of other companies. So sort of talk about, I mean, obviously, I think probably when you joined, I'm going to guess like 90+% of the revenue was from your on-prem. Because I think when you went public, it was like 70 or 80% was from your on-prem business. And so let's talk about sort of the strategy around making that transition, but sort of managing both and keeping both along the way.
Yeah, I mean, it's been, we've always celebrated just the customer's choice. And, we started as an on-prem business. We actually started the cloud business really early, right? Like, and I think first incarnation of it was sort of like, we'll host our products for you, sort of like the application service provider approach, maybe in like 2006, and then came out with sort of the first incarnation of the cloud platform in like, 08, 09, and then have just been, continuing to modernize that and, make sure that it's built for the hundreds of thousands of customers that are on it today and, the future hundreds of thousands. I think we were really early in recognizing that there's a material benefit to customers in the cloud, and there's a benefit to us because, of the velocity through which you can acquire customers and kind of the additional telemetry that you get around how your products are being used that help you both shape the product, but also help you engage and activate users and customers faster. And then just, broadly, the trend, like you could see it coming. But there's still going to be, industries and customers that are slower to make that transition or have reasons that they're not ready to make that transition. And so we've, maintained on-prem for them. And 95% of customers today, start in the cloud. And the rate of migration for existing customers to the cloud has been accelerating over the past 5 years. And so I think that the destination is sort of clear. And I think we've done a really incredible job of managing both platforms. And by the way, also modernizing both platforms, which is hard. Oftentimes you see the enterprise software company kind of incumbency in on-prem getting displaced by somebody else in the cloud.
Sure.
On one level, we had to displace ourselves. Like we had to, kind of compete with our on-prem business, in a way to make it even more desirable, but not, intentionally handicapping kind of the on-prem product for customers, for whom it's still important. That's a hard thing to do, right? I think history is sort of littered with examples of companies that just couldn't do that, and they're replaced by the cloud version of them, right? And, I'm super proud. It's like hard work, but I'm super proud of how, Atlassian has managed that over the years. And I think customers are too. Like, we've celebrated that choice while still, trying to kind of highlight the benefits of cloud. And there's things that you can do in the cloud product that you can't do in on-prem without tremendous effort. And I'll give you an example of one of those. We Confluence is a collaborative content writing system. It started out as a wiki, and now it's sort of a full-fledged collaborative content system, for businesses. And we came out with, a real-time synchronous editing experience, in the cloud, which is pretty easy to do in the cloud, or like not easy, but easier to do in the cloud. And very difficult to do on-prem, but we did it. And that's an example where, I think we've been true to saying, like, a lot of this innovation, a lot of the differences that you'll see in sort of like a modern cloud product, we're going to try to bring to the on-prem product. And eventually, I think Atlassian probably has to make some choices around when are those things too difficult, for kind of a smaller customer base that's remaining on-prem to do.
Yeah. The crazy part is, your server business, which was sort of these one node licenses where you would install Jira or Confluence onto a single server, and it was the same price. It was like, $10 for 10 users. That business had massive consumption. Like there was, and I think you used a lot of partners, and so there's probably a lot of MSPs that were deploying that for customers. And I think, just recently the team at Atlassian actually end of lifed that specific server offering. It didn't end of life, all of the on-prem offerings, because they still have that data center product that you're talking about. But sort of this idea that smaller companies with 10 users should be deploying and managing on-prem software. That's the narrative that I think was moving away from at Atlassian. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think if you look, there were two versions of on-prem, kind of the standard one and the data center one. And the data center one was always priced comparably. It was actually priced identically to the standard one, beginning at like 500 users. And so it was a better product at 500 users for the same price as sort of the non-enterprise one. And then I think, if you looked at below 500 users, there may be particular reasons for a 200-person company to say, I want this behind the firewall. But we worked really hard to remove them. And then there were, in some cases, like the on-prem was, still just like super, super cheap. And so somebody could say, well, it's a little bit cheaper, so I'm actually going to download it and kind of install it, and not recognizing that, there's additional costs that make it a lot more expensive for them over the long run. And, there's a belief that the cloud is ready for all those users. It is, it's ready for all those users. It's where should we go? And kind of maintaining on-prem products for smaller companies and smaller teams doesn't make sense. Where we've got one actually that, for maybe if you've got 100 users, you have to buy the 500 user license at the data centers. It's a little bit more expensive than you would have for the 100 user, but that's actually the price that you should be willing to pay if on-prem is a hard requirement for you.
Yeah, exactly. I'm kind of realizing, because I listened to a podcast with one of your architects maybe a couple of years ago talking about the latest cloud platform and all the choices that were made. And one thing that struck me is that, they were basically completely separate products. Like the, Jira on-prem offerings and Jira Cloud had two different engineering teams, product teams, support teams. Like they were run almost like separate, organizations. Correct?
Yeah, it wasn't always that way. It used to be like the cloud was effectively the on-prem code base,
right,
that was then shipped to the cloud. And when we really chose to kind of modernize the cloud and build it for multi-tenancy and kind of re-architect it to run workloads on AWS, we effectively forked the code base. And actually, that's when I took over the on-prem products and began to kind of rebuild the cloud for cloud native, which we needed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that division happened probably like 6 years ago, 5 years ago, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously our thesis is that eventually your on-prem product will merge back again with that cloud native architecture, and and you'll be able to serve sort of those customers from at least a more shared code base. But those things take time. So
yeah.
Okay, that's super helpful. I really appreciate all that context. And I guess just for, I don't know, I mean, are there any? There's probably some amount of public numbers that were shared throughout your tenure there in terms of how big that on-prem business was versus the cloud. I think, like I said, during the IPO, it was like 70%. I'm sure over time it's diminished in terms of revenue percentages instead of customer count.
Yeah. I mean, I think Atlassian's, they probably even talked about it in the last earnings call, but, it's diminishing as a percentage of total, and cloud is where, a lot of the growth is. I mean, there's still growth in on-prem because it's a big business in the enterprise, but
it's a rising tide. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so let's hop into a little bit more about these acquisitions that you made, because I think that's one of the really interesting things is, you mentioned 15 products, a lot of those through acquisitions. Some of those like Bitbucket seem to go pretty well, but maybe HipChat not as well. Like, how do you think about, the acquisitions? And I mean, obviously Trello I think has gone really well, but like talk about some of those and sort of, how you think about them.
Yeah, I mean they're all different. I think the one kind of common signal in all of them is that we were early in identifying kind of the market opportunity for those products, and kind of the great technology, and then they're all sort of like logical complements or adjacencies to where we are. And so I think we did a good job of sticking to our knitting. And the dynamics in kind of all those markets are different. HipChat was I think an example of maybe being a little bit too early, and also not, if I'm really self-critical, not recognizing like how big that market could be and how quickly the market could open up. It's hard. Like sometimes, like I think even Stuart at Slack would say it was like he didn't anticipate that, and it was sort of like this combination of timing, also in concert with social media as sort of like a word of mouth channel. At the time that HipChat and Slack, and especially Slack were just kind of emerging, really Twitter as a way for people to share what they were really excited about was just emerging. And I think that was a pretty important accelerant around kind of market awareness for, chat and real-time communication. I mean, certainly there's been, analogs that kind of predate it, but like the modern approach to that sort of like took off as people began to use it and, were excited about it. And I think it's sort of it's hard to transport yourself back in time knowing what you know now, right? Like it's hard to sort of like take all that and be like, oh, like here's what it looked like.
Sure.
I just remember we were looking at HipChat and it was sort of growing faster than any other Atlassian product, and you're like, man, that's just like, look at that growth, it's just great. not recognizing that it could be going 3 or 4 or 5 times faster than that. And we need to build a product for that. Like we need to build a product for that kind of scale and that kind of growth, which is, probably the thing that we should have done earlier.
Yeah. But I mean, there's like the one side is you saw the opportunity, you acquired this company for probably like, realistically pennies in the dollar in terms of opportunity, and it was growing. You're like, oh, this is great. But like, I guess the insight there just being like, okay, we should have invested more and gone at it even harder in order to capture the full opportunity.
Yeah. And sometimes it is about like timing matters, right? Timing in sort of these things that, that are amplifiers in the moment or amplifiers around the space. It's like Chatter, like, by the way, the product matters a lot too, but, like Chatter kind of predated, both HipChat and Slack, I think, and, very different product and approach to both of those, but also, maybe didn't live up to its potential, its full potential when you think about like what it could have been. And, I think when I think about, Slack did a masterful job of, building kind of a great product and then also capturing the zeitgeist, capturing the moment, by being an authentic company and listening to their customers and continuing to like not falling over and continuing to sort of like ride kind of the energy of what is this thing and I want it and my friends are using it and they're excited about it. And that's a really hard thing to create, right? Like you can't manufacture that. Like it's sort of like in the moment you're sort of paddling with it. You know what I mean? And you have to like paddle with it and be really good. That takes a lot of work too and skill and doing all the right things, but it's really hard to create the current.
Yeah. I mean, when you talk about, Chatter, your Yammer, these other things that I don't think that they were even really close to what Slack ended up becoming, because ultimately the integrations were so valuable. But I mean, this is like actually intended as a compliment. Like HipChat was definitely the closest, right? It was like, it had the makings for what could have happened there. And I think that you're right when you say that it's sort of, sometimes it's just about timing. It's about market, sort of how they perceive it. And then eventually, that ends up being the multiplier.
Yeah. I mean, it's, HipChat predated Slack by a couple of years, and
right.
It's, for whatever reason, Slack didn't use it. I've never asked Stuart why, but maybe they did. And they were like,
they're like IRC people, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. But, it's funny. It's like sort of like what could have been if they had used, they had just used HipChat.
Yeah. That's funny. They, when they were at Tiny Spec, were building a game, right? If they had used HipChat instead of trying to build their own thing. One other piece that I don't think many people talk about, and I don't know if you have much insight into, but I know that within Atlassian, you've always had a really strong both like partner ecosystem, but also third party sort of application marketplace ecosystem. Hundreds of millions of dollars, spent through your systems with these applications in your marketplace. Was that always a kind of a key part of the growth and the strategy? Like, how did you nurture that marketplace and those ecosystems?
It's a really interesting case study, because marketplaces are also really hard to build. And the way we built ours, I think, was also a little unconventional. We started with extensibility, just as sort of like a core principle of the product. Like there are APIs, we're going to use them to build the product. We're going to let you use them to build extensions and add-ons and plug into the product in a way that feels native. We started there. And that kind of existed for a handful of years, and customers used it. Third-party developers began to build around it. ISVs began to kind of integrate with it. And then we had sort of like a volume of these things that existed, like developers that were building. So we did all the kind of right moves around creating developer docs and, a little bit of a community where developers could find each other, and created an event called Atlas Camp, where we brought, developers in the ecosystem together physically, for 3 days to sort of like work with us on APIs that they wanted to improve or add. Did all that. And then, for the customer, we wanted a coordination point to point them at these things. And so we the first incarnation of the marketplace was just a directory. It was like, okay, we're going to work on curating where they all are, so you don't have to hunt and peck. And we'll be a sort of a central kind of pointer to where these things exist. Then we just recognized that a lot of these small developers and ISVs had to do a heavy lift on like, great, I've built something that people want, but now I've gotten, by the way, this is like, again, all sort of pre-Stripe and maybe easier ways to sort of like build kind of like a simple commerce front end on something. But, it was hard for them to kind of create that and then manage the selling relationship with the customer. And from the customer's perspective, it was hard for them to basically buy 10 things in 10 different places and have that be scattered. And so, it was pretty easy to say, well, we've already got this directory. Like we're pointing kind of everybody at all of these things. We can add sort of like commercial store to this and make it easier for both the customer and the developer. And that should encourage more volume and should encourage, more customer demand. And that in turn should encourage more supply. It's sort of like that virtuous cycle.
Yeah.
And that's what happened. And, we've always seen, the marketplace, I think still Atlassian would echo this, seeing the marketplace is not, even though it is a big source of revenue, like not a source of revenue, but a source of this pretty potent kind of ecosystem, partner ecosystem, and kind of network around the company where, businesses are being built on top of Atlassian. And that matters more to us than, the money that we're making. And, the money that we're making really is, I think, just supporting kind of like all the things that we're doing to make it better so more people can build businesses. That's where it works. And, the other benefit to us is, where a customer gets more value from the platform because there's more things that give them value. And that value in turn increases our stickiness, right? There's more things that they're using, and so it becomes more compelling. It's not an easy thing to build. There's lots of examples, in history where companies have tried to do it. And I think one thing that they do is they say, well, hey, here's a store, now start building for it. I think that's hard. Like we tried to do, and Plumtree tried to do that with portlets. Where we tried to build a marketplace of kind of portlets that you would build, and it just didn't work. And I think the fact that we had critical mass of developers and there was so much surface area that we allowed them to build on that was actually mature meant that when we did begin to commercialize, they already had businesses that were being built. And that was a signal to other developers that, hey, actually, like I could build something to make money from it. I'm going to do that.
I'm going to kind of also guess that potentially some of these tools added functionality that maybe filled gaps. And, we talked about some of those enterprise features and requests, maybe some of those gaps were filled and made those problems less acute because the marketplace existed.
Yeah, that's right. It's like we could focus on sort of the pieces of the platform that we need to build.
Yeah.
And kind of the long tail of different things that various parts of our customer base needed could be provided by third parties.
And some of those could be like, hey, there's a demand for it. And you'd be like, well, you could build that. And, we have a system of SIs or other, partners that could even build it for you and manage it. And they could sell it again in the marketplace.
That's right.
Oh, man. Yeah, that's beautiful. That's really nice. Let's take a quick jump into what you're doing now, because you've left Atlassian and joined Bond. So tell me about what you're doing there.
So Bond is a growth stage investment firm, and I'm an investor now. I mean, the main reason that I did this is after, being a builder for 25 years, kind of focused on just building kind of one thing in one company. It's thrilling to get to work with lots of different companies and lots of different markets. That's sort of point one. And the growth stage of what companies are trying to kind of grow through and where they're getting to, I've just got a lot of scar tissue and experience around, and the chance to be helpful and useful, to founders and entrepreneurs that are thinking through how their business model gets architected and all the different dimensions of what you could do when you build your business model is exciting. Or, even like how the culture is going to change as you go through these inflection points of 100 employees to 500 employees to 5,000 employees, or how your strategy, planning cadence, and operating rhythms need to evolve. Like all that stuff I've just got a lot of. And so part of what drew me to investing is the chance to be useful to companies that are going through the phases that I've been through, because it's not easy. And then the thrill of learning about their businesses, learning about their markets, and that's sort of the really exciting part of the job.
With maybe a little less stress and the pressure.
Well, I'll feel their stress and pressure. Yeah. You'll kind of miss those moments too. I mean, those moments are, you're in it right now. I mean, those moments are, even though it's stressful and, there's anxiety with it, it's also at the other side of it. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah. And just what stage are you looking to invest in primarily?
We are a growth stage. And so I would say it's like past product market fit. You've trains are on tracks, and kind of you've got repeatable revenue, and you understand how to define your market and the customers that you're going after. But there's still a lot of building and execution to do.
And your first investment, was it Zapier?
No, my first investment was, I'm on the board of Zapier that predated Bond.
Oh, okay, predated Bond, got it.
But my first investment was a company called Sentry.
Oh, amazing open source company.
Yeah, fantastic company.
Love them. Jay, I know you got to run. This was so great. I really, really appreciate all your time.
Oh, thanks, Grant. It was fun.
That's all we have time for today. If you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, or just to learn more about enterprise features, find us at enterpriseready.io. To learn more about Heavybit, visit heavybit.com to check out the library. It's packed with amazing talks on sales, marketing, product, and general management from founders of developer tools companies and other industry leaders. This podcast is also brought to you by my company, Replicated, where we enable cloud-native software vendors like HashiCorp, CircleCI, Sneak, and many others to operationalize and scale the distribution of their modern on-prem applications to their largest enterprise customers. Check us out at replicated.com.